I remember the first time they said it to me, the first time they called me something I didn't recognize. Mom, you're a burden. It was said so casually, as though it were no more than a passing comment about the weather. Just a little remark, a flick of the wrist, something easily brushed off. But it wasn't easy to forget. Not for me. Not after all the years I had spent building my life around them, around my son, around the family I thought would always love me. They said it at the dinner table one evening, just like that, casual, offhand. And that was the moment I realized they didn't see me anymore. Not really. They didn't see me as someone who had once been the center of their universe, someone who had raised them, fed them, wiped their tears, and shared their laughter. They didn't see me as someone who had held the family together, even when it was falling apart. No, I was just a burden now, a forgotten thing they had to deal with, like a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. I am 79 now. I live alone. I suppose that's not a surprising thing for someone my age. People my age tend to be alone. It's just part of the cycle, part of the way life turns. But it wasn't always this way. Not when I was younger, not when my children were small, not when my house was full of noise and laughter. I once had a family who needed me, or at least I thought they did. I once had a home that felt like a place I belonged, a place where my presence mattered, where my touch meant something, where my voice was heard. But that was before. Before the silence began to creep in, before I started to notice that I wasn't really seen anymore, that I wasn't really heard anymore, that I wasn't really needed anymore. I don't know when it started exactly. Maybe it was gradual. Maybe it crept up on me, little by little, like the erosion of a once great mountain that slowly wears down until it's nothing more than a pile of pebbles. Or maybe it was sudden. Maybe it happened the first time I found myself standing at the kitchen sink, peeling potatoes for a dinner that no one was really going to enjoy, that no one was really going to appreciate. Maybe it was the first time I sat in my favorite chair in the living room, only to realize that no one had bothered to ask how I was feeling. No one had bothered to check on me. Or maybe it was when I stopped being invited to family gatherings altogether, when the invitations stopped coming, when the calls stopped coming, when the texts were fewer and fewer, when I stopped being mom and started being just the old lady, just a thing that occupied space in the house, just a thing that they felt obligated to take care of, but not a person. Not really. It was at that dinner, the one where they told me I was a burden, that I realized something fundamental had shifted. They weren't my family anymore. They were strangers. They had turned me into a stranger. I sat there, across the table from my son, who once called me his best friend, and his wife, who had always been so kind to me. I sat there, and I could feel it, the distance between us. It was as if an invisible wall had been built between me and them, and no matter how hard I tried to reach through it, no matter how much I longed to be the person I had once been to them, I couldn't. I couldn't break through. They didn't see me. They didn't care. They didn't want to see me anymore. They didn't want me in their lives. I stayed silent. What was there to say? How do you respond when the people you've loved your entire life, the people you've given everything for, look at you like you're nothing more than an inconvenience? What do you say when they tell you in so many words that your very existence has become a problem for them? I didn't say anything that night. I just sat there, quietly, with my hands folded in my lap, pretending that the words hadn't cut as deeply as they had, pretending that it didn't matter, pretending that I was fine. But I wasn't fine. I wasn't fine at all. The truth is, I haven't been fine for a long time, not since the day they first started treating me like I didn't matter, like I wasn't worth the trouble. I should have stood up then. I should have said something, anything. But I didn't. I didn't, because I had spent my whole life being the one who kept things together, being the one who kept my mouth shut for the sake of the family, for the sake of peace. And maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe I had been too quiet, too accommodating, too willing to sacrifice my own needs and desires in the name of keeping the peace. Maybe I had allowed myself to be erased, little by little, until I was nothing more than a faint memory of what I once was. A shadow in the corner of the room, a name on a family tree that no one ever bothered to look at. But that night, when they told me I was a burden, something inside me snapped. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some grand emotional outburst, but I felt it. A shift inside me. A recognition that I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. I couldn't keep sitting there, waiting for them to remember me, waiting for them to care. I had to do something. I had to reclaim my life, reclaim my worth, reclaim my dignity. So I left. I left that dinner. I left that house. I left that life behind. I walked away, and I haven't looked back since. The road ahead is uncertain, I know that. I'm not sure what comes next, but I know one thing. I'm done pretending. I'm done being invisible. I'm done being the woman who fades into the background. I am still here. I am still me. And I am going to make sure that the world knows it. This is my story. A story of loss, of betrayal, of being forgotten, but also a story of strength, of finding my voice again, of reclaiming my place in this world. And if this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt invisible, ever felt like you've been pushed to the side, I want you to know that you are not alone. You are still here. You still matter. And it's never too late to make sure the world knows it. It was the phone call that did it, the one I received while sitting at my kitchen table, sipping tea, looking out the window at the garden I had spent years tending. I had always found solace in the routine of the mornings, the quiet, the stillness, the smell of fresh flowers mixing with the scent of earth after the rain. It was early enough that the world hadn't fully woken up yet, the sky a soft shade of lavender, the birds singing softly in the trees. I had just finished watering my roses when the phone rang. It was my son, Daniel. I hadn't heard from him in days. Not that it was unusual. It had become a pattern over the years. The calls would come less frequently, and when they did, they were brief, impersonal. He would ask how I was. I would tell him I was fine, and he would say he was busy with work, with the kids, with everything. I understood, of course. Life got busy. But somewhere along the way, it became clear that I wasn't a priority anymore. I wasn't even on the list of things that needed tending to. I was just there, in the background, a fixture that had once mattered but had now become part of the scenery. "Hey, Mom!" Daniel's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and detached, like it had always been. "How are you?" "I'm good, sweetheart," I replied, trying to sound cheerful, to mask the ache that had been gnawing at me for weeks. I hadn't realized just how much I was missing his voice until I heard it again. And I had to remind myself not to lean too heavily into the longing. It was too late for that. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear him shifting around, probably in his office, probably distracted by something else. "I've been meaning to talk to you," he said finally, his voice low, a little hesitant, like he wasn't quite sure how to say the next part. "We're planning a family reunion this weekend, you know. Just a small gathering. Everyone's coming, and Carla and I thought it'd be nice if you joined us." I felt a twinge in my chest at the mention of the reunion. It had been years since I'd been invited to one of those. Years since anyone had asked me to join them for something that was supposed to feel like family. It wasn't that I wanted to go, exactly. I didn't even know if I could stomach the idea of sitting at that table, watching them interact like they had never left me behind. But the fact that they were extending an invitation, it meant something. At least, I thought it did. "That sounds lovely, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound casual, like it was no big deal. "I'd love to come." There was another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his words were carefully measured. "Great," he said, his tone a little too upbeat. "Just don't mention anything to anyone about, well, you know, about the house and what we've been dealing with. We don't want to make things awkward with Carla's side of the family, and you know how people can be. It's just easier that way, Mom." The words hit me like a punch in the stomach, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Easier that way. The way he said it, like it was a simple favor, like I was being asked to ignore a truth so it wouldn't upset the delicate balance they had so carefully constructed. Don't mention anything. He didn't need to say it explicitly. I knew what he meant. He was asking me to stay silent about the house, about the years I had spent helping him make it his, about the money I had poured into that place, about the promise I had made to myself that I would always be there for him, no matter what. He didn't want me to mention it because it didn't fit with the story he was telling, with the life he had created for himself. It didn't fit with the life he wanted people to see, the one where he had it all together, where he had built everything himself, where he didn't need anyone. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I understand," I said, my voice thick with the weight of the words I wasn't saying. "I won't say anything." "Thanks, Mom," he replied, the relief in his voice palpable, as though he had been holding his breath, waiting for my agreement. "We'll see you this weekend, then." The call ended quickly after that, and I sat in the silence that followed, my fingers curled tightly around the phone. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, the air thicker. I stared at the wall in front of me, but I couldn't see it. All I could see was the image of Daniel, standing in the doorway of that house, looking at me like I was something to be hidden away. A relic, a thing to be kept out of sight. I had spent my life helping him, supporting him, loving him unconditionally, and now he wanted me to be a shadow. He wanted me to be silent about the things that mattered to me, about the sacrifices I had made. He wanted me to pretend I didn't exist in the ways that had shaped his life. But it wasn't just about the house. It was about everything. The years I had spent making sure he felt loved, the hours I had devoted to his well-being, the sacrifices I had made in my own life so that he could have the life he wanted. And now, suddenly, I was nothing more than an inconvenience. I spent the next few days in a daze. The invitation to the reunion weighed heavily on my mind. Should I go? Should I stay home? It wasn't about the reunion itself. It wasn't about wanting to see the family or wanting to play the part of the doting grandmother. It was about the fact that I had been invited in the first place, after all these years of being pushed aside. I kept thinking about what Daniel had said, how he wanted me to play the role of the invisible mother, the one who didn't matter, the one who had no voice. How could I show up at that reunion and pretend that everything was fine when I knew the truth? When I knew how little I truly meant to them? I didn't tell anyone about the phone call. I didn't tell them how it made me feel, how it shattered whatever illusion I had left about the family I thought I knew. I didn't tell them how the invitation to the reunion felt like a cruel joke, a reminder that I was still just a placeholder in their lives. I kept it all to myself. But in the days leading up to the reunion, something began to shift inside of me. I had been quiet for so long, had let them take so much without ever asking for anything in return. I had let them erase me, let them dismiss me, and I had never fought back. But now I was starting to feel a stir of something deep inside me, something that had been buried for far too long, a quiet anger, a fierce need to be seen. I don't know what exactly made me decide to go to the reunion that day, but I went. I told myself it was for closure, that I needed to face whatever was left of the family I had known. But in truth, I was going because I was finally going to say something. I was finally going to stand up for myself. I didn't know what was going to happen when I walked through that door. But I knew this. I wasn't going to be silenced anymore. Not by Daniel, not by anyone. The first thing I noticed when I walked into the house was how clean it was. The kind of clean that felt unnatural, like everything was placed exactly where it was supposed to be. Everything was polished, every corner neat, every cushion fluffed. There was no dust, no wear and tear, no sign of life that had lived in this space. The house felt more like a showroom than a home, a place where everything had been designed for appearance, for the perfect facade. I had seen it before, of course, during my visits when Daniel first moved in with Carla, before they had kids, before their lives had settled into this picture-perfect routine. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like I didn't belong, like I was intruding on something that didn't have room for me anymore, something that was no longer meant for me to be a part of. The grand staircase with its immaculate banister, the stainless steel appliances in the kitchen that gleamed like they were straight out of a magazine, the family photos that lined the hallway. All of it felt like a carefully constructed set, where I had no part to play. I had been in this house countless times before, and yet today it felt unfamiliar. The air was thick with expectations, with unspoken rules about where I should be and what I should do, how I should act, and how much space I was allowed to occupy. The heavy silence of it all, the absence of warmth in the greetings, the polite but distant smiles. It weighed on me, pressing down on my chest as I walked further into the house. Daniel was there, of course, with that same tight smile he always wore, the one that said he was pleased to see me, but not too pleased. It was a smile that had come to feel more like a mask over the years, one that hid everything he wasn't willing to say aloud. His wife, Carla, was bustling around the kitchen, setting the table with an air of practiced efficiency. The kids were upstairs, as usual, lost in their own world, their laughter distant and muffled. It felt like everything was happening just outside of my reach, as if I was an outsider in my own family's home. I don't know what I expected from this reunion, but it certainly wasn't this. I had told myself that it would be a chance to reconnect, a chance to finally be part of their lives again after years of being pushed aside. I had hoped for something real, something that would remind me of the family we used to be. But there was no room for realness here, no room for honesty. The only thing that seemed to matter was keeping up appearances, keeping up the facade of the perfect family, where everyone played their part and nothing ever disrupted the image they had worked so hard to build. It became clear to me in those first few minutes that I wasn't a part of that image. I wasn't even a part of the family anymore. I was just a relic of a past they had long since outgrown, a ghost in the background that no one really wanted to deal with. And as I stood there, in the middle of the house that I had helped build, I could feel it, the creeping sense of being invisible, of being irrelevant. It wasn't the first time I had felt this way, but it was the first time I had been forced to face it so openly, so unapologetically. As the evening wore on, the cracks began to show. Daniel and Carla kept up their polite conversation, asking about my health, about my travel, about anything that could fill the awkward silence between us. But there was no real connection, no real interest, just small talk, the kind you make when you're trying to fill a void but don't really care what the other person says. The children never came downstairs. I didn't expect them to, of course. They had their own lives now, their own priorities, but the absence of their presence only deepened the sense of exclusion I was already feeling. I sat there at the table, with my hands folded in my lap, trying to seem engaged, trying to play my part, but the truth was, I wasn't there. Not really, not in any way that mattered to them. At one point, Daniel's phone rang. He excused himself and stepped into the other room to take the call. Carla, too busy with her preparations, didn't notice that I was left alone at the table, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house, by the sterile, empty air. It was in that moment that I felt it most acutely, the distance between us, the distance that had grown so wide over the years. I wasn't sure when it had happened, when they had stopped seeing me, but I knew it had happened. They didn't need me anymore. They didn't want me in their lives. It was as if I had been replaced, as if they had moved on and left me behind, stuck in a time that no longer existed. I had been the mother, the one who had always been there, who had always made sure everything was in its place, who had held the family together when everything else was falling apart. But now, I was just a memory to them, a footnote in their lives. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could live with that. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing minute, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I could feel the weight of their discomfort, their unease around me. It wasn't overt, but it was there, lingering in every glance, in every word that went unsaid. It was in the way Carla hesitated before offering me a drink, in the way Daniel didn't quite meet my eyes when he returned from his phone call. They were walking on eggshells around me, as if they were afraid of something, afraid of what I might say, afraid of what I might reveal. And I realized with a sinking feeling in my chest that they weren't just trying to keep up appearances. They were trying to control the narrative, to make sure that I didn't disrupt the story they had created for themselves. They didn't want me to speak the truth. They didn't want me to remind them of what they had done, of how they had treated me, of how they had forgotten me. They wanted me to play along, to stay quiet, to stay in my place. It was then that I understood. This wasn't just about a family reunion. This wasn't just about a gathering of relatives. This was about control. They wanted to control the way I was seen, control the way I was remembered, control the way I fit into their lives. And for the first time in a long while, I realized something crucial. I didn't have to let them control me anymore. I didn't have to let them dictate my worth, my place in their lives. I didn't have to let them erase me. Not anymore. But in that moment, I also realized something else. I had been complicit in this, hadn't I? I had allowed them to treat me this way, to push me to the side, to make me feel small and insignificant. I had been quiet. I had kept my head down. I had accepted the way they had treated me because I thought it was what I was supposed to do. I thought it was my duty, as their mother, as their grandmother. But it wasn't my duty to be invisible. It wasn't my duty to be nothing. The dinner dragged on, but I could hardly stomach the conversation anymore. Every word felt like a lie. Every laugh, every smile, every polite exchange felt hollow. I didn't belong here. I didn't want to belong here. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't have to stay. I didn't have to keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. I could leave. I could walk out that door and never look back. I could stop being the woman who stayed in the background, who smiled through the pain, who accepted the scraps they threw her way. I was more than that. I had always been more than that. And the time had come to show them that. But I didn't leave. Not yet. I stayed because I wasn't ready to let them off the hook just yet. I wasn't ready to walk away from the family I had once known, even if they didn't want me anymore. But I knew deep down, that the time was coming. The time was coming when I would have to make a choice. I would either stay in this house, in this role they had cast me in, or I would walk away. And when the moment came, I would walk. I would walk and never look back, because I wasn't invisible anymore, and I wasn't going to let them forget it. The morning of the reunion was pale and silent. I woke early, not out of excitement or anticipation, but from the quiet dread that had been curling in my stomach like a cat in a corner. I moved slowly through my routines: coffee, a slice of toast, a glance at the weather through the kitchen window, as if the normalcy might tether me to something solid, something real. But I knew nothing about that day would be normal, not with what I had overheard the night before. I had been standing at the top of the stairs, half hidden by the wall, when I heard Daniel and Carla talking. Their voices weren't raised, but their words were clear. Carla was going through the guest list, her tone brisk and tidy. Daniel, quieter, had said, "Just don't let anyone ask about Mom. If she shows up, fine. But don't draw attention. Just say—" There was a pause. "Say what?" Carla had asked. "Just say she passed a while ago. No one here knows her anyway." I hadn't moved. I hadn't gasped or dropped anything. I had stood still, watching the hallway wall breathe in the soft light from the guest room window, and felt something ancient in me snap without sound. They had killed me off, not in body, but in presence, in narrative, in convenience. They had erased me from the story, quietly, confidently, as if it were nothing more than a line to edit out of a speech. A late mother. That was what I had become. Not a woman still alive, still capable of thought and opinion and memory, but a figure rendered easier to manage by absence. That line, his late mother, stayed with me like a smudge on the inside of my chest, something I couldn't wipe away no matter how many times I tried to pretend I had misheard. I had not misheard. I had simply been forced to hear the truth. So I got dressed. I didn't wear beige or the dusty cardigan Carla had left for me on a hanger like a uniform for the docile, the invisible. I wore navy, deep and unyielding, a colour that had always made me feel strong. I put on the pearl earrings Derek had given me for our 40th anniversary, not because they were flashy, but because they reminded me I had once been treasured. I brushed my hair back, dabbed a little colour on my lips, and stood before the mirror, not to admire, but to confirm. I was still here. I hadn't gone anywhere. I was not a ghost, not a fading photograph. I was a woman with a spine and a history and a voice, and I would not let them carry on with their fiction unchallenged. The venue was one of those gleaming rental halls with polished wood floors, folding chairs disguised as elegance, and tables dressed in rented linen. The decorations were tasteful: paper lanterns in cream and gold, framed photos from family vacations and weddings, a slideshow projected on one wall showing curated moments from everyone's lives but mine. I walked in without fanfare. I wasn't met at the door, wasn't announced, wasn't even noticed for a good 5 minutes. I made my way to the refreshment table, poured myself a glass of lemon water, and took in the room. I spotted Daniel near the bar, speaking to a group of men in navy suits. Carla flitted between tables, her smile wide and bright, polished for company. I stood at the edge, watching, waiting, and then I heard it again. "This is Daniel," a voice said. His mother passed a few years ago. He's done so much since then, really stepped up. I turned. It wasn't Daniel speaking. It was a colleague, someone introducing him to another guest. But Daniel didn't correct it. He nodded, smiled humbly, accepted the false narrative like it was easier than truth. Something shifted inside me then. Not a rage, not a despair, but a stillness so profound it felt like the moment before thunder. I walked forward, slowly, deliberately. I passed the buffet, the chattering clusters of cousins and in-laws, the politely curious eyes of distant relatives who had never known me and never cared to ask. I approached the long banquet table in the center of the room, and without saying a word, I placed my glass on the linen, hiked up my skirt just enough to lift one foot, and stepped up. Then the other. I stood. On the table. In the middle of their beautiful, tidy, curated family reunion. It took a moment for anyone to notice. Someone dropped a fork. A child giggled. Carla's voice, mid-sentence, faltered. Daniel turned. His mouth opened, closed. The room fell silent. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice calm, unshaken. "But I thought you should all know. I'm not dead." There was a pause, and then the murmurs. Quiet, startled. Someone coughed. Daniel took a step forward, his face pale. "Mom, get down." "I'm not finished," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The silence in the room held it aloft. "You might have heard I passed, that I was gone. And in a way, that's true. I was gone. From their lives, from their thoughts, from their stories. I was edited out for convenience, for image, for simplicity. But I didn't die. I simply faded, because no one made space for me. No one called. No one asked. And now I find myself here, standing on this table, because I need you to see me. Not as a ghost, not as a burden, not as a footnote, as a woman who is still here, who loved, who gave, who mattered. The room was frozen. A wine glass tilted in someone's hand. A camera flash went off by accident. "I gave my son everything I had," I continued, turning to look at Daniel. "And somewhere along the way, he decided that wasn't worth remembering, that I was easier to manage as a story than as a person." "Mom," Daniel said again, his voice cracking now. "Please." "Why?" I asked quietly. "Because I'm embarrassing you? Because I don't fit the picture?" He didn't answer. He looked down at the floor. I stood there a moment longer, breathing slowly. No one moved, no one spoke. And then, with a grace I had forgotten I possessed, I stepped down. My knees ached, my hands trembled a little, but I landed steady. I picked up my glass, took a sip of the now warm water, and turned toward the door. As I walked, people parted. Not out of respect, perhaps. Not yet. But out of discomfort, confusion, fear of something real. I left the reunion without another word. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because something had shifted. Not in them, in me. For the first time in years, I had taken up space. I had disrupted the script. I had said aloud what no one wanted to hear. And while it didn't change the way they saw me, not yet, it changed the way I saw myself. I was not waiting anymore. I was not hoping to be invited. I was not begging to be remembered. I was alive, and I had just reminded them that the dead don't stand on tables and tell the truth. The forgotten do, the ones who remember everything. The days after the reunion stretched out before me like a long grey road, each one heavier than the last, each one weighing me down with the knowledge that I had crossed an invisible line, a boundary I could not take back. I had made my stand, I had said my piece, but I couldn't escape the feeling that, while they might have heard me, they hadn't listened. They hadn't truly understood. The phone stayed silent, as it always did after any confrontation. There were no calls, no texts, no messages. It wasn't surprising. In a way, I had expected it. They had all but erased me from their lives for years. Why would this be any different? But what caught me off guard, what stung more than I expected, was the silence that followed. I had wanted something. I had hoped for something. A shift, a recognition, an apology, perhaps. But there was nothing. The world around me carried on as if I had never spoken, as if my voice had no weight, as if the truth I had spoken was just another unpleasant noise to be dismissed. Daniel never called. Carla didn't reach out. The cousins, the friends who had been at the reunion, they all went back to their lives, their polished, perfect lives. And I was left standing at the edge, wondering if I had truly made a difference. It was harder than I thought, harder than I had imagined it would be to walk away from the illusion of being wanted, of being needed, even after everything, even after standing on that table and telling them I was still here. I found myself questioning whether I had done the right thing. The silence was crushing. It was not the silence of peace, of reconciliation, but the silence of rejection, of being ignored so completely that it felt like I had vanished once again. I stayed in my own house, the house that had once been full of laughter, full of children running through the hallways, full of dinners that lasted well into the night. And now it felt empty, the air thick with the weight of the years I had spent, trying to keep everything together for them, trying to make it all work, trying to be the woman they needed me to be. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window, watching the rain fall in a steady stream, the world outside grey and muffled. I thought of everything I had given up to be part of their lives, to be part of their story, and how in the end it hadn't mattered. I thought of how I had let myself be erased, how I had let their disregard for me become my reality. And I thought of how, even now, even after everything, I still felt like I didn't belong. It wasn't until I received the letter that I realized just how far they were willing to go to keep me in my place, to keep me silent, to keep me invisible. It came one morning, thick and official, the kind of letter you get when something important is happening, when someone is trying to make a statement, when they are about to put something into action that will change everything. I opened it carefully, my hands steady, but my heart racing, and inside I found a letter from a lawyer, a man I didn't know, a name I had never heard before. It was a formal letter, a demand, really, a request for a meeting to discuss my well-being and my assets. The letter was signed by Daniel and Carla. It was polite, cold, professional in a way that made my stomach churn. They had hired a lawyer, hired someone to make sure I didn't step out of line again, hired someone to do what they couldn't bring themselves to do. Control me. I sat with the letter in my hands, reading it over and over again, as if the words might change with each pass, as if something would make sense that didn't make sense before. But it didn't. It wasn't about my well-being. It wasn't about my health, or my happiness, or my future. It wasn't about me at all. It was about control. They were trying to control the narrative again, trying to control the way I was seen, trying to make sure I didn't disrupt their carefully constructed lives. The lawyer was just a tool, a weapon they could use to try and force me back into the box they had built for me. The box where I was silent, where I was manageable, where I was nothing more than an afterthought in their perfect little story. I couldn't believe it at first. I had expected many things, but this was too much. It was one thing to be ignored, to be forgotten, but it was another thing entirely to be treated like I was a problem that needed to be fixed, like I was something that had to be controlled. It made me realize that they hadn't heard me when I spoke at the reunion. They hadn't listened at all. They hadn't understood that I was done, that I wasn't going to play their game anymore, that I wasn't going to be their compliant mother, their obedient grandmother, their dutiful parent who waited for scraps of attention. I wasn't going to be that woman anymore. But they couldn't accept that. They couldn't accept that I had found my voice, that I had stopped being afraid. So they hired someone to make sure I stayed quiet. The letter sat on the table for hours, untouched. I couldn't bring myself to respond right away, couldn't bring myself to acknowledge the fact that they were trying to reassert their control over me, over my life, over my choices. I couldn't do it. Not yet. I needed time to process, time to figure out how I would handle this new escalation, this new attempt to push me back into the shadows where they thought I belonged. And in the quiet of that moment, I realized something. I had been living in fear of them for far too long. I had been living in fear of their rejection, in fear of their disapproval, in fear of what they might think of me if I didn't conform to their expectations. But that fear had lost its power over me. It had no hold over me anymore. And now, I was the one with the power. I was the one who had the strength to stand up for myself, to refuse to be pushed around, to refuse to let them treat me like I was a relic of the past, like I didn't matter. I folded the letter neatly and put it in a drawer, not because I didn't want to deal with it, but because I knew that when the time came, I would deal with it on my terms, not theirs. I would not let them dictate my life any longer. I would not let them use their power to control me. And in that moment, something inside me clicked. Something deep within me shifted. I wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. Not ever again. The next few days passed slowly. I didn't make any phone calls, didn't reach out to anyone. I kept to myself, taking long walks through the neighborhood, getting lost in the routine of my own life. The weather grew colder, the days shorter, and with each passing moment, I felt the weight of the decision I had made. To stop being afraid, to stop hiding, to stop waiting for permission to live my life. But it wasn't until the lawyer called that I knew what I had to do. I answered the phone with a calm I didn't know I was capable of. The lawyer's voice was polite, efficient, his tone one of detached professionalism. He spoke to me as if I were a child, as if I needed someone to explain the situation to me, as if he thought I would be intimidated by his words. I listened, let him say what he needed to say, and then I told him, quietly, firmly, that I wouldn't be meeting with him. I told him that I didn't need his help, that I didn't need anyone to speak for me, that I was perfectly capable of managing my own life. I told him that whatever they were trying to do, whatever they were trying to take from me, I wasn't going to give it up. Not anymore. And then I hung up the phone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you are standing your ground, from knowing you are no longer afraid, from knowing you are not invisible. They wanted to control me, but I had already taken back control of my own life. I was not their project. I was not their responsibility. I was my own woman, and no one was going to take that from me. Not again. The phone call came just as I was finishing my morning coffee, the kind of call I had been dreading without realizing it. My hand trembled slightly when I picked up the receiver. It was the lawyer again, his voice clipped, professional. He wasted no time with pleasantries. He had a proposal, a settlement offer from Daniel and Carla. They were willing to meet with me, he said, to discuss things, to work something out. They wanted to avoid further complications, he explained, his voice as cold as the weather outside, as if I were some simple problem to be solved, some contract to be finalized. I didn't let him finish. I had heard enough. I had heard all the lies, all the manipulation, all the well-crafted promises they had used to wrap themselves in the illusion of control. And I was done with it. "I don't need to meet with them," I said, my voice firm, clear, and stronger than it had ever been. "I don't need to work something out with them, and I certainly don't need you to speak for me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the lawyer's surprise, the way he was processing what I had said, how I was no longer the woman he expected, the one who would listen, the one who would be easily swayed. "I won't be meeting with Daniel or Carla," I repeated, my words hanging in the air between us, each one heavier than the last. "They don't get to control this anymore. Not my life. Not my decisions. Not me." The silence on the other end of the line stretched out, and for a moment I thought the lawyer might try to persuade me, might try to find some angle to make me feel guilty, to make me believe that I was doing something wrong, but he didn't. After what felt like an eternity, he simply said, "I'll relay your message." Then he hung up. I stood there for a moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear, the coldness of the phone somehow grounding me. I had done it. I had finally stood up to them. I had finally taken control of my life in a way that was irreversible. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scene. But it was everything I had needed to do. I wasn't a passive observer in my own story anymore. I wasn't the person who just sat back and waited for others to decide my fate. I was the one making the decisions now. And for the first time in a long time, I felt an immense, overwhelming sense of freedom wash over me. Later that afternoon, I received another unexpected call. This one wasn't from the lawyer. It was from Kieran, my grandson. His voice came through the line, warm and familiar, and hearing it felt like stepping into the sunlight after a long time spent in the shade. "Grandma," he said, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice, the uncertainty. "Grandma, I don't know what's going on, but I want you to know I'm here. I've been trying to reach you. I saw the article. I saw the lawyer's letter. And I don't understand. I want you to be okay." The words hung in the air, soft and genuine, like a lifeline being thrown to someone who had been lost at sea. I had never realized just how much I had missed hearing his voice, how much I had longed for someone, anyone, to reach out to me, to tell me that I mattered, to tell me that they saw me. I had spent so many years feeling invisible to my own family, so many years waiting for someone to notice me, to recognize the person I had always been, the person they had once known and loved. And now, here was Kieran, my grandson, reaching out to me, his words filled with something I had not felt in so long: care, love, concern. It was enough to make my heart ache. "I'm fine, Kieran," I said, my voice steady despite the overwhelming flood of emotions. "I'm more than fine. I've made my decision. I'm not going back. I'm not going to let them control me anymore. I'm done." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked just a little. "I'm glad. I'm really glad, Grandma." I could hear the relief in his words, the sense that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when things would change. "I've been worried about you, you know, and I don't know what's going on with Mom and Dad, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. I always have been. You're not alone." The words hit me harder than I expected. All this time, I had been carrying the weight of everything on my own, convinced that I was forgotten, that no one cared. But here was Kieran, telling me I wasn't alone, telling me that I still mattered to someone. And for the first time in years, I felt a tear slip down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of relief, of release. I wasn't alone. I wasn't invisible. And I had finally stopped waiting for people to notice me. I had finally started living for myself. That evening I sat down to write. Not a letter to Daniel, not to Carla, not to the lawyer, but to Kieran. My heart was full as I picked up the pen, the words flowing easily onto the paper, as if they had been waiting for years to be written. I wrote to him, telling him everything I had never said before, everything I had kept locked inside for so long. I told him how much I had missed him, how proud I was of the man he had become, how I was finally ready to let go of the past, to stop waiting for permission to live my life. I told him I was free now, that I was finally free from the ties that had bound me to a family that had forgotten who I was. And at the end of the letter, I wrote something that felt like the truest thing I had ever said. I am enough. I always have been. The letter was short, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. It was simply the truth. And I knew, as I sealed the envelope and wrote Kieran's name on the front, that this was the moment I was truly free. I had taken back my voice. I had taken back my life. And no one could take that from me. The following week, I heard nothing from Daniel or Carla. I didn't expect to. The lawyer never called again, and I didn't care. I was done with them, done with their games, done with the control they had tried to exert over me. I had walked away from that world, and I wasn't going back. I spent my days quietly, in the ways I had always loved, reading books I had set aside for too long, cooking meals for myself, visiting the small cafe down the street where I had made friends with the barista, a kind woman named Heather, who always had a smile and a joke to share. And then, one evening, Kieran called again. This time there was no hesitation in his voice, no fear, no uncertainty, just warmth. Grandma, I'm coming to Portland. I want to see you. Just me. I'm staying at the Red Fern Motel on Maple. I'll be there Friday and Saturday. If you want to come by, I'd love to see you. If not, I'll understand. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a plea. It was simply an invitation. The invitation I had been waiting for all along. The invitation to be seen, to be remembered, not as someone else's mother or grandmother or wife, but as myself. And I knew, in that moment, that this was the beginning of something new, something I had been waiting for, without even realizing it. I didn't hesitate. I didn't wait for the fear to rise in my chest. I didn't question whether I was making the right decision. I simply packed my bag, took my coat, and left. I was going to meet my grandson. I was going to take that step into the life I had been building for myself. And no one, not even Daniel or Carla, could take that away from me. Not anymore. The day I arrived at the Red Fern Motel, the sky was a crisp shade of blue, the kind of blue that makes you want to stretch out your arms and breathe in deeply, as if it can fill you up with something new, something fresh. The air was still cold, the kind of cold that bites just enough to make you glad for a coat, but not enough to make you feel unwelcome. I parked the car in front of the small, faded office, the kind of place that didn't try to be anything it wasn't, just a simple, unpretentious stop along the way. As I stepped out of the car, I took a moment to look around, at the tall trees swaying gently in the wind, at the neat rows of motel rooms, each one small but solid, each one offering a quiet refuge from the world. This was where Kieran had chosen to stay, this place that seemed so far removed from everything that had happened, from everything that had tried to bind me to a life that wasn't mine. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I was certain that it wasn't going to be the same as it had been before. I had changed, and Kieran had changed too. I walked into the office, the bell above the door jingling softly as I entered. The clerk, a woman with short-cropped grey hair and a friendly smile, glanced up from her computer. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm, open. I told her I was here to see my grandson, Kieran, and she nodded immediately, her expression softening as if she already knew who I was, as if she could sense something about me, something that wasn't quite visible to everyone, but that she could recognize just the same. "He's in room 12, she said. "Second door on the left. He's been expecting you." I thanked her and left the office, walking slowly toward the row of rooms. My heart was beating faster now, not with fear, but with anticipation, with the quiet thrill of knowing that this moment, this simple, ordinary moment, was the culmination of everything I had fought for in the last few months. I had fought for my voice, for my agency, for my right to be seen, to be heard, to be a person in my own right, not just a backdrop to someone else's story. And now, here I was, standing in front of a door that symbolized everything I had come to reclaim. I knocked gently on the door, the sound of it sharp in the quiet afternoon. There was a brief pause. Then the door swung open, and Kieran stood there, his face breaking into a wide, relieved grin when he saw me. "Grandma," he said, his voice soft, his eyes bright with something like hope. "I'm so glad you came." I smiled, my heart swelling with the sudden warmth of it, the relief of being here, being with him, with someone who still saw me, still cared. I stepped inside, and the room was small but cozy, with a bed covered in a faded quilt, a small table by the window, and a few pictures on the walls. It wasn't much, but it didn't need to be. It was perfect. It was real. And it was a space where I could be exactly who I was, no pretenses, no expectations. Kieran stepped aside to let me in, and we both stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, like we were still trying to figure out the shape of this reunion, trying to grasp at the threads that had brought us here. He didn't say anything at first, just watching me, his expression serious. I could see the questions in his eyes, the curiosity about what had really happened, about the distance between me and the rest of the family, about everything that had gone unsaid for so long. But he didn't press. He didn't need to. He knew that I would tell him when I was ready. I took a deep breath and sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to explain everything that had happened, everything that had brought me to this moment. But I knew I had to start somewhere. So I did. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out where I went wrong. I began, my voice quiet but steady, trying to figure out when I stopped being the person I thought I was, when I stopped being the person I thought they needed me to be. I paused, looking down at my hands, and I realized it wasn't me who changed. It was them. They stopped seeing me. They stopped needing me. And I let it happen because I thought it was easier to be invisible, easier to be quiet, easier to just fade away. Kieran sat down next to me, his gaze never leaving me. "You weren't invisible, Grandma," he said softly. "Not to me. Not ever." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I swallowed it down. "I didn't know how to be anything else," I said, my voice thickening with emotion. "I didn't know how to fight for myself, not after all those years of giving and giving and giving, only to realize that they weren't really seeing me, that they were just taking, and I was letting them. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to stop letting them decide who I was." Kieran didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, next to me, his hand resting gently on mine. I could feel the warmth of it, the simple comfort of knowing that someone was there, someone who wasn't judging me, who wasn't trying to fix me, but who just wanted to be there with me. In this moment, in this space that felt like the first real home I had had in a long time. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," he said after a while. "I don't think you realize how strong you are. You've been through so much. But you're still here. You're still fighting." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. "I don't feel strong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm just starting over, like I'm trying to figure out who I am again, like I'm a stranger to myself." "You're not a stranger," Kieran said firmly. "You're you. And you always have been." We sat in silence for a while after that, just letting the quiet of the room fill the space between us. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that had led me here, felt less heavy in that moment, as if Kieran's words had lifted some of it off my shoulders. It wasn't over. I knew that. There was still a long road ahead of me, still the reality of what had happened with Daniel and Carla to face, still the aftermath of my stand, still the process of rebuilding my life, of learning how to live without the shadow of their expectations hanging over me. But in this small room, with Kieran beside me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from silence or from hiding away, but the kind that comes from knowing you have done the right thing, from knowing that you have fought for yourself, from knowing that, in the end, you are enough. Kieran leaned back, his eyes searching mine, and he smiled that smile I had known for years, the one that always made me feel like everything was going to be okay, no matter what. "So, Grandma," he said, his tone light, "what do you want to do while I'm here? Anything you've been wanting to do? Anything you've been wanting to say?" And for the first time in a long time, I realized that there was no script anymore. There was no pressure, no expectations. There was just me and Kieran, and the chance to live my life on my own terms, to rediscover what it meant to be seen, to be heard, to be truly alive. I smiled back at him, feeling the weight of everything that had happened finally settle into its rightful place, like the end of a long and difficult journey. I said softly, "I think I just want to enjoy being here, with you." And in that moment, I knew that I was finally free. Not just from the family that had forgotten me, but from the version of myself that had let them. I was free to be who I was meant to be, to live the life I had always deserved to live. And that, I realized, was all I had ever really needed.